Listen, I did film and television studies at university for 3 years. I spent hours reading countless books and articles on subjects spanning from film all the way to television. Not a single one mentioned Hugh Grant once.
I achieved the hardest qualification across any university or college ever, a 2-1 in history. Let me tell you, the only thing that I learned was that we, as a society, have a history of denying and neglecting Hugh Grant's artistic and cultural relevance, not just in this country, but in the entire world.
I met Oscar at a Hugh Grant-themed event I put on at the Students' Union.
It felt as though Diggory and I were the only ones there, and we agreed that there was a Hugh Grant-shaped hole in academia.
We decided to put it right ourselves. We want to show people that he's an icon in acting.
We want to show people he's more than just a bumbling posh guy.
I'm Diggory Waite.
And I'm Oscar Beardmore Gray. And this is...
Taking You for Granted.
Hello and welcome to Taking Hugh for Granted, the podcast in which two Hugh Grant enthusiasts watch every single film starring Hugh Grant in the attempt to answer the simple question: is this film taking Hugh for granted? Is this film good on its own, or does it rely on the bumbling Brits for its acclaim? I'm Diggory Waite. I'm joined as always by my colleague and fellow Hugh Grant obsessive Oscar Beardmore Gray. Oscar, how the bloody hell are you doing today, mate?
I'm doing very well, Diggs. I mean, I'm still kind of in a slight state of surrealness, just because we obviously finished recording Travaux, the last of Hugh Grant's feature films.
Yeah.
But the reaction that we've had from our fans is been really, really nice. And, you know, it has hit home that we have hit a serious milestone in our podcast.
Yeah, we've done it. And to be honest, yeah, like it'd be funny because people would think, I've been listening to the podcast and we keep doing this every episode. But like, it is such a buzz. It is such a buzz. And I'm thinking, you know, we should probably do some big fat Twitter thread being like, I watched all of Hugh Grant's films and this is, you know, and then go through like all 43 or however many there are. Because also I think within that, people would want to see things like The Undoing and Very English Scandal, but like, and there's something to be done there.
I also see other podcasts who put in a lot more time and effort into their social media. It makes me think that they have like an intern or something, or maybe they just spend their entire life doing it, who have these like beautiful graphics and stuff that I think we could do that, but God, it takes forever.
I've got my own job. I've got a job that I have to do, an actual job. Yeah, there's no time for that. I was thinking this actually. I knew someone whose sister was really wanted to get into social media and stuff, and was like taking any job she could. And I was like, I really was like, do you know what? If I just said to her, listen, Taking Hugh for Granted is essentially a company at this point. We've been going long enough.
Look, we've got a LinkedIn page.
Exactly. We've got a LinkedIn page. Surely I can just be like, can I put your sister under slave labour to do our social media?
It's bad, isn't it? Because I complained so much when I was an intern about the fact that I didn't get paid. So it would be very hypocritical to get someone to work hours on our social media. But it would be great. So, it would be... If you're out there,
that's a great idea. If you're out there and you want to work with us and you want to do our social media, get in contact. We'd love that. Also, if you want to do my washing, that'd be great as well. I really have some very, very dirty clothes behind me and on me, actually. I never wash. So yes, two separate things. Social media and my washing. Please do get in touch. It's takinghughforgranted@gmail.com. Wonderful. Shall we get straight on with I guess this is a TV film we're talking about today, called The Trials of Oz. Any relation to the wizard, do you think?
I don't know, Diggs.
Let's find out from Synopses Simon. Take it away.
The Trials of Oz, based on the memoirs of Richard Neville, written by Geoffrey Robertson QC, directed by Sharif Folkeson, and released as part of the Performance Anthology series in 1991. After releasing a particularly risque edition of the British underground magazine Oz, Richard Neville, played by Hugh Grant, and his fellow editors are put on trial and charged with obscenity in what will become a famous case in 1971.
Wonderful synopsis from Synopsis Simon there, as always. What did you think about the context of this film?
Yeah, well, I didn't know anything about the Trials of Oz, to be honest, and I don't know if many people in the audience would. If you're an older generation who lived in the UK, you might do, I assume. But it was all new to me, but really had a good time sort of learning about it. I mean, Synopsis Simon would have summed it up a little bit, but basically it was a kind of obscene magazine, kind of counterculture of the late 1960s. And it, had a lot of pornography and outrageous things. The thing they get caught up on here is Rupert Bear, who is a UK cartoon having a massive phallus, and there's a comic strip of him doing naughty things, and the judge in particular seemed to take exception to that. But I didn't know a lot about it, but it's really interesting, kind of. And we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, about sort of parallels of kind of thinking about free speech and censorship and all this kind of thing, and themes, obviously, of kind of homosexuality and homophobia and all that kind of stuff. But really fascinating background to this particular trial. What did you think of it? And did you know anything about it before you went into it?
Exactly the same as you, had absolutely no idea. And that's why actually the version that we watched, which I guess is the version that was broadcast on BBC Two back in the day, was great because before, like the film's about an hour and a half long, and beforehand they've got this like 10-minute little quick documentary intro thing with Richard Dimbleby, who's obviously quite a big deal over here, and which was great because in this short little 10-minute piece, it gets you fully up to speed with who Richard Neville is, this guy from Australia who actually had the Oz magazine. It's called Oz magazine because it's an Aussie thing, and was originally arrested over there because in one of the pictures that they put in the magazine was people like urinating on a wall. So part of the reason he came to the UK was to sort of escape that hysteria over there. Then sets up London Oz. Like you say, Oscar, they have this particular edition which has this horrendous comic in it, which everyone takes great offence to, with the bear and the phallus. But it was great. It got me up to date straight away. And like you say, it was really interesting. And what's so interesting about this film in particular as well is that the language and the script is all verbatim. It's literally what was said in the courtroom. And actually, that is really, really fascinating because...
It gives you a great insight.
Exactly. It gives you a great insight. And also, I suppose courtrooms are like, they are all drama. And so, but it's interesting that, like, so often I feel like you have to craft drama, and script writers will spend ages being like, oh, let's do this, do that, whereas this is like, we're just taking it from the time, and there was suspense and there was drama, and every character felt like a character, if that makes sense. It's better than a lot of the Hugh Grant films we've seen where people have tried to craft a drama and tried to craft characters, and this isn't trying to do that, and it does that really well.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may be wondering why one of us is defending himself. This is because I have no wish to hide behind the wigs and gowns of the legal profession. I believe that I should try and talk to you directly and tell you how and why we publish Oz. Now, Oz is not destructively anti-society. Oz is a sounding board for people with new things to say and nowhere else to say them. So, for example, there's been a homosexual Oz, edited by homosexuals for the usual Oz readership. There's been a women's liberation Oz, edited by Germaine Greer, a women's liberationist, and distributed to the usual Oz readership. This edition was edited by school kids, but was intended for the normal Oz readership.
I actually spoke to Synopsis Simon about this film before I watched it, and I said to him, because, as you can probably tell from his voice, he's a man of a certain age, and I said, Simon, do you remember the Trials of Oz? And he said, oh, yes, is Hugh Grant in it? And I said, yeah, he is. And he was like, he's not Richard Neville, is he? And I was like, well, I've done a little spot check. I don't think so, because I can't imagine him doing an Australian accent. Then the film starts, and Hugh Grant is Richard Neville. Unbelievable. But I think, just to get straight off the bat with that as well, is they haven't made him do an accent.
They haven't made him do an accent, but he does the accent at the end. Did you notice that?
It's so weird. So like we say, Richard Neville is an Australian person. He had an Australian accent. When Hugh Grant was announced to be Richard, I was like, what is going on here? There was a few, so obviously I was listening out for an accent. He definitely doesn't have one. But every now and then, and like you say, particularly at the end, you're like, you're doing it. You're doing a very, very slight Australian accent. I wonder whether maybe they filmed the last bit first.
Yeah, that's what I
And
was
they were
thinking.
like, maybe, yeah. And he was like, maybe I'll go for this. But yeah, very, very odd.
Dylan sang, "Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land. Don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand. For the times they are a-changing."
So, Diggory, what did you think of Hugh Grant in this movie?
Well, we've mentioned a little bit about the accent, which, we've talked about that. But I think that was what I was most fearful of: is is he going to do an accent and is it going to fucking suck? If he did do an accent and it sucked, that would have been really funny, and I would have loved that. The fact he didn't meant that I probably paid more attention to the film, which is good. He's got such an interesting character in this because Richard Neville clearly was a very. I read a bit more about him afterwards. He was an outgoing guy, a clever guy, a bit of an anarchist, bit of a like self-starter and stuff. And what's so interesting in this film and in real life is he represented himself. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah.
So instead of having his own defense lawyer or whatever, he did it all himself. And he said to the jury, like, listen, guys, I don't want to hide behind any lawyers or anything here. I want to do it all myself, which is so cool. I had to really try my hard to get the Australian thing out of my head. But once I did do that, Hugh Grant plays the role just like that. Like a slightly cocky guy who's just like trying to, who kind of finds this whole rigmarole, this whole like lawyer courtroom rubbish is exactly that, rubbish. And even though the threat is very serious here, he could go to prison, he's like, fuck it, you know, I'm gonna be myself, I'm gonna do what I do, I'm gonna be a bit cheeky, I'll make the jury laugh, things like that. And Hugh Grant played it, I think, really quite well. What did you think?
I thought he was brilliant, Diggs. I really did. I mean, just quickly as well, he really has quite a funny look, a very hippie 1960s kind of Sex Pistols sort of vibe going on. Very, very cool. He's got hair down to his shoulders, a bit like Restoration, but way cooler.
Oh, yeah, like he'd looked in Restoration, yeah.
And I just thought that his delivery was effortless, to be honest. He really he really fit the role well, and he was so silky smooth in his in the way that he went about his stuff. And like you said, like a touch of sort of arrogance that really came across well. But
just a touch, like I say, just not too much, you know. Yeah.
But it was believable that he would be defending himself in court. Like it was that level of kind of cockiness.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And I think I think the skill of that in his delivery is that any more than just a touch, and I would have been like, ugh, I don't like this guy. He's too cocky. He's too arrogant. And I do think genuinely that's down to the acting, because any more, like, or any less the character wouldn't go across of this guy who is a bit outgoing any more, and I would have been like, oh, this guy's just horrible, and I don't back him. Which I think. Do you think this film is trying to put us on the side of the three men on trial for Oz?
I certainly think so. I mean, maybe you know, I think it is fairly neutral, but you know, this came out on the BBC in 1991. This trial was it 1971? Yeah. So I guess 20 years after. Yeah. And it's amazing how much changed between the late 60s, early 70s, and the early 90s. Like I don't know. In my head, I just picture the early 90s as, you know, Spice Girls,
exactly,
all that kind of stuff. Like, you know, just a lot more of a open and liberal society. And what this trial shows is that you still had a judge who's in his 70s, probably pre-war. Slightly sort of repressed and very conservative, stiff upper lip, and that is reflected in this kind of battleground between the kind of new counterculture that which now is very normal in our society now in 2020, and one that was pre-war basically.
Yeah, and like you say, and this a lot of the conversations here are about sex positivity, and this Oz magazine was very sex positive, and it's sort of stuff that today, that's what's actually so good about this film and about this trial, is like today this is still going on. Sex positivity is like still going on. You've got more recent feminist movement of women being like, yeah, I want to have an orgasm and things like this, and like the Me Too movement and all these sorts of things, and like, so it's still a massive thing. Oh, like Wet Ass Pussy, like that song is, sex positivity as is out there for everyone to see. And it's so funny that is also how far we've come from 1991, and then also where 1991's come from 1971. So it's all very interesting, but also like their attitudes to drugs as well, which also still is something that I guess we've come even further, because now in America and like, in Canada and stuff, places like that, a lot of these drugs that they're talking about are illegal. So there's all these things that, looking back on them with our mindset, is so different. But when they look back on them in 1991 as well, even though it's maybe been 20 years, we're doing so different. So it's such an interesting film in that way, and it's made even more interesting because it was all real.
Well, I'm taking you for granted. Well, I'm
if there was to be a villain of the piece, he sort of shows himself at the end. The judge in this has sort of been he's been a bit snipey here and there, but it's not too bad. But when he sums everything up at the end, it was very reminiscent of me for the judge in A Very English Scandal, who was really horrible to Norman Scott and kind of like threw the whole thing out of whack with the jury and stuff. And this felt very similar. His sum up was really biased.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we now approach the last stages of this trial. These three accused are charged, firstly, with a conspiracy to corrupt public morals, secondly, with contravening the Obscene Publications Act, and thirdly, with sending indecent material through the post. Another example to help you with indecency is this. Let us say you attend an athletic or stage event, and the athletes, beautiful physical creatures, male or female, haven't got clothing which fits properly. And as they compete, or as they appear on the stage, you can see their private parts. That is immodest and indecent in this country.
Like you said, Diggs, you could tell there was a part of him that just really didn't like Hugh Grant's character and the magazine, thought it was obscene, but he did let the two barristers kind of throw their arguments. He listened to the witnesses, but there was a real sense at the end when he was addressing the jury that he was being biased, and in the end, as it happens, the whole trial was quashed because of the way that he addressed the jury at the end. I mean, there's a couple of things that perhaps we should know about the judge, having done a little bit of digging on him. His name was Judge Argyle. He's played by Leslie Phillips, who you might have seen what is the voice of the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter.
Difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind either. There's talent, oh yes, and a thirst to prove yourself. But where to put you?
Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin.
Not Slytherin, eh? Are you sure? You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. There's no doubt about that. No?
Please.
Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor!
Having checked him out afterwards, it all sort of makes sense, because he was in the army in the Second World War. He ran to be a Conservative Party MP in the 1950 and 1955 election.
Here we go.
He then, way later when he retired in 1987, he actually received a public reprimand from the Lord Chancellor for public statements that foreign immigration to the UK was out of control, and also argued that capital punishment should be reintroduced into England's judicial system for certain crimes.
Wow.
So,
oh my word.
Knowing all that, it's not a surprise that he didn't like grotesque imagery in magazines. He didn't seemingly like people who weren't religious. He didn't like Richard Neville because he supported gay rights and drug use. So overall, he's our villain, isn't he, really?
Yeah. And it's so funny because at the end when he's doing his big sum up, and like you say, he goes through every witness, who a lot of them are experts, and they've talked about the pros of the Oz magazine, and there are some. I want to stress to people that haven't seen the film, like we've talked about, they're really sex positive and stuff, but they were pushing homosexual rights, women's rights, and they backed this up by getting, on these editions where they looked at these things, they got people, like I said, they got the kids to edit these things, they got people of colour to do special editions, like they pushed these issues, and which is really great. And on their stuff on drug use, like they weren't just being like, oh, drugs are great willy-nilly. That would be ridiculous. Like they were really, sounds like anti-heroin, but they were like, maybe pot and stuff is less bad. So I'm keen to stress that. But like you say, so when the judge did his like sum up and was going through all these experts who were talking about, where the magazine was actually good and when it was read by its intended audience, he would always reference whether they swore on the oath or whether they affirmed, which is obviously swearing to no God or creed, which is very interesting. And also, the only positive thing I think he had to say about any of them was about the young woman who was like, she brought light to the...
She was a nice girl.
Yeah,
which is
which was a bit, whatever. But I remember sitting there and thinking, when he was saying all this stuff that seems so emotive and so biased, like you say, I was like, have I forgotten what the role of a judge here is? I like, my idea was a judge was supposed to be completely impartial, and then he does this mental conclusion where he's just, shouting, like completely swaying the whole thing, which is insane. And what makes it again so much more fascinating is that this isn't fabrication. It's not even based on a true story. This is verbatim.
Have you reached a verdict upon which you're all agreed?
No, sir.
Have you reached a verdict upon which at least 10 of you are agreed?
Yes.
On the count charging the defendants with conspiring to corrupt public morals, how say you? Guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
On the count charging the defendants with publishing an obscene article?
Guilty.
Though the results have nothing to do with me, may I say how much I agree with your verdict? Inspector Love, have deportation papers been served on Richard Neville?
They have, sir.
I shall not pass sentence till I've seen prison, medical and psychiatric reports on these men. They will be remanded in custody for this to be done.
My lord, it really is inhuman to keep them in suspense any longer.
These reports are a lot of bureaucratic nonsense, as you well know.
I refuse to accede to your request. Take them down.
We haven't even mentioned that our great Hugh Grant friend Simon Callow plays the defense barrister in this courtroom, and he just, in his final sum up, there were a couple of lines that I just really liked, that really sort of sum up this whole kind of trial and how almost pointless it seemed, especially to us now. Obviously 50 years on, it's very different, but he sort of explained the prosecution's argument as like, when a young schoolboy in the street sticks out his tongue at a public official, he calls in the army, which is kind of true. Like, this kind of small counterculture magazine probably didn't have that many subscribers, probably wasn't making that big a splash, and basically they come the public officials come down like a ton of bricks on this thing just because they didn't like it, and they didn't want to hear what they had to hear, or they didn't want to hear their opinions. And it rings true now, doesn't it, at the moment? And it's the idea he says at the end as well, we must learn to live with each other and be tolerant of alternative ideas we may have, and not stifle each other's ideas and lifestyles, which I think pretty much sums up the whole trial. It's like, at the end of the day, these guys had some other ideas. The conservative elite of the society at the time, which was a kind of repressed pre-war generation, didn't like that.
and as a result, kind of threw the book at them, which, looking back of it, looks really bad. But I just think it is just kind of a really interesting snapshot into kind of 1960s, 1970s counterculture, and that's why it was so great. And even better that Hugh Grant was in it.
And he got to have the hair.
Yes.
Taking he for granted. Taking he for granted. Taking he for granted. What did you think, lads? Were they taking he for granted?
Oscar, The Trials of Oz, 1991. Are we taking Hugh for granted?
Come as no surprise to you, Diggs, we are not taking Hugh for granted. This might be one of Hugh Grant's best pre-Four Weddings and a Funeral pieces that he does. I know I think I said that before, but I was really, really happy to watch this. Like, I think you're right that the kind of verbatim element of this just... You know, when it's kind of like when you go into cinema and the first thing that comes up is based on a true story. This is more than based on a true story. This is the real story. Yeah. And I think that just made it really exciting and just a sort of sit up in your seat drama that was acted really well. And you know me, I'm a bit of a history buff. I love this kind of stuff. And it was just a really, really fascinating film. What did you think?
Yeah. I echo everything that you've said. Also, I mean, it's so interesting as well that they're both like just on the cusp of different decades, because you, as I say, it's like the counterculture of the late 60s, early 70s, and it's just like as things are shifting slightly there, and you know, it's maybe counterculture is coming to a sort of crescendo as we knew it then with the hippies and the psychedelic stuff as well. It's funny as well when this film was made. It was made in 1991. And you can sort of feel some of the late 80s inspiration in it. Like, at the beginning, and I'll stick with it, because this film, because at the beginning I was a little bit perturbed by some of the stuff going on, like their heads floating around at the screen. And then every now and then when he'll say something, and then they'll add this like delay on the end of some...
And then the room will just spin as an effect.
Yeah, exactly. And that was all, I believe, quite 80s sort of vibe. And obviously this film came out in 1991, but I think they're using a lot of those sort of like, whoa, sort of, you know, crazy 80s sort of aspects of it. But it's so interesting that, like I say, both of these, like both the actual trial in 71 and this film in 91, you can the hangover of the previous decades definitely make their impact. But as I say, it's a bit jarring or maybe a bit weird at first, but stick with it. This is, like you, bit of a history buff. This sort of thing gets me going. Listen, synopsis, Simon needs to see this film. His main thing that he loves more than anything else is synopsis. But apart from that, his second thing that he loves more than anything else is courtroom dramas. He needs to see this because knowing that it's verbatim, he'll absolutely love that. And so did I. And as I say, that's great, but it needs to be backed up with great acting and it needs to be compelling. And the subject matter, like sex positivity, drug stuff, is all relevant today. That's what's so interesting about it as well. It's still all relevant today. It's still a debate that you can still have. And they had it here. You can hear it verbatim. It's acted brilliantly. And Hugh Grant looks mental, but acts it fantastically. So we have not been taking Hugh for granted. It's a great film.
Brilliant, Diggs. Couldn't have put it better myself.
Boom. There we go. Bloody hell, we're having a good time at the moment.
Yeah, excellent stuff.
I'm starting to think, you know, pre-Four Weddings and a Funeral is better than post.
Yeah.
There's some serious, absolute bangers in here.
It's like an iceberg, isn't it? It's like...
that's so true.
Everyone can see the creme de la creme at the top, but they don't know all the beautiful... sharp edges down below in the ocean.
Oh my god, that's so true. And there's so many of them. There's that's the thing. Everyone can see Notting Hill. They've seen Love Actually. You know, they know even about The Undoing that just like nestles above the water and glistens in the sun. But beneath the waters, there's The Lady and the Highwayman and Remains of the Day.
Yes.
And Champagne Charlie, things like that.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Absolutely wonderful. Well, we're having a lot of fun. And we'd like you to continue having a lot of fun with us. Please wherever you listen to this, subscribe, follow, make sure you're up to date with all the episodes, because there's more coming. Even though we've watched all of his films, we've got more films, we've got more TV shows, we've got everything on the way, and I'm sure more Hugh's news as well. We're eagerly awaiting the release of his new film, Operation Fortune Rose de Guerre, so please stay in touch with us for that. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Taking Hugh for Granted on both of those, or Twitter at Taking Hugh. Wow, I think that just about sums it up, doesn't it?
You think it does, Diggs? You did it very well, as always.
Thank you. How do they end things in the court? What do we say?
You just smack the
gavel. All right.
Diggory, you are sentenced to 2 more years of Taking Hugh for Granted content.
Oh no! How could I possibly deal with that? Oh.
Taking Hugh for Granted is produced, edited and presented by Diggory Waite and Oscar Beardmore Gray. The producers of Taking Hugh for Granted would like to state that this podcast is in no way associated with the actor Hugh John Mungo Grant, nor does it endorse his views or represent him in any way. Instead, by creating this podcast, Oscar and Diggory hope to celebrate Hugh's illustrious career, reliving his old classics and shedding light on some of his hidden gems. Hugh, if you're listening, we hope you approve.